Elia Kazan is a director with a strange reputation. Ask people about him and you'll get one of two responses: adoration.
He taught us a new respect for ourselves as actors and the potential power of our profession.
Or detestation.
Elia Kazan is a traitor.
To a modern film viewer, Kazan is also a director who is not particularly well known. But when you look at his career, it becomes clear that he played an influential role in film history, as his films helped to transform the way actors and audiences saw the art of performing, and ushered in a new, more realistic style of film. He also directed two films, which won the Best Picture Oscar.
Wins the honors for the best production of the year, Gentleman's Agreement.
On the Waterfront.
In this video, I'll focus mainly on these two films as I explore Kazan's impact on cinema, explain the controversy around his career, and question whether the actions of an artist should affect how their work is perceived. Hi, I'm Jacob, and you're watching 1728 Film. The history of Elia Kazan is closely linked to the history of acting, so it's important before we discuss the man that we discuss the performance style of 1930s and 40s Hollywood. Film acting was, at the time, a relatively new craft. Acting with sound had existed for just over a decade, and most actors in films came from a theatre background. Acting was viewed as external, with actors using their entire bodies to show the character's emotions, and good enunciation was a key part of any performance.
Suit the action to the word to the action.
And, whilst this acting style is effective in certain situations, its theatricality doesn't always suit the medium of film as well as it does the stage. As Marlon Brando once described when talking about the classically trained Laurence Olivier, this kind of acting can be effective on the stage because audiences are far away, but it becomes absurd in the movies in which audiences can see the actor's expressions magnified hundreds of times in close-ups. Things began to change when the ideas of Russian director Konstantin Stanislavski crossed the Atlantic and began to take hold in America. Stanislavski is perhaps the person who has had the greatest impact on theatre since Shakespeare. Bored of the stale acting of late 19th century Russian theatre, he set out to develop and teach a new style of acting which put emotion at the forefront of everything. He would call this his system, and it would ultimately become known in America as the method. I won't go into full detail on the Stanislavski system, but in its simplest terms, Stanislavski's main aim was to find a way to train actors to become the characters they were playing, and therefore truthfully feel and show emotions to an audience. As Isaac Butler describes in his book about method acting, The Method, experiencing does not mean to fully become the character or lose sight of the self. Instead, actors' living consciousness and the fictional consciousness of the part they are playing meet. To Stanislavski, living the part was the highest ideal, an artistic mountaintop that all acting strove to reach. In 1924, Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theatre toured America, and afterwards several of its members remained in New York and began teaching Stanislavski's ideas to Americans. Several of their students would, in 1931, get together and create the group theatre. The group theatre aimed to transform American theatre by performing socially relevant plays in a realistic manner. And it was here that a young Kazan first began to work. Starting as an actor, Kazan soon built up a reputation for his passion and eagerness to learn, ending up working across multiple roles on productions, and earning the nickname Gadge, or Gadget, for his tenacious attitude and ability to solve problems. By the mid-1940s, he was a well-established director with a reputation for bringing out the best in actors, and it was about this time that he also began to direct films in Hollywood. His first three films, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, The Sea of Grass, and Boomerang, can each be seen to represent a different aspect of Kazan's journey, as he learned about the differences between theatre and film. In A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, he showed his skill in drawing out performances from actors. In The Sea of Grass, he developed a hatred of studio control. And in Boomerang, he was allowed to experiment with a more realistic style of filmmaking, filming on location and using real people as extras. Then, in 1947, he agreed to direct Gentleman's Agreement, a film which would shine a light on the rise of anti-Semitism in post-war America. And whilst the film is admirable for doing this, being one of the first films to say the word Jew on screen, the way it goes about it does sometimes feel a bit cringe, at least to me. The story follows Gregory Peck, a journalist who is asked to write an article about anti-Semitism. After umming and ahhing about how to approach the subject, he finally settles on a plan.
I got it. The lead, the idea, the angle. This is the way. It's the only way. I'll be Jewish.
So that's just what he does. Changing his name, he begins to tell everyone in his life that he is Jewish. It isn't long before he starts to see the difference in the way he is treated by others. Restaurants, co-workers, and even doctors start to reject him, and his son experiences bullying at school.
They call me a dirty Jew.
His newfound love interest, played by Dorothy Maguire, who is initially supportive of the plan, also struggles with the experiment, putting their relationship under strain.
You're no more Jewish than I am. It's just a horrible mistake.
Kathy.
So, as you can probably guess from my quick rundown of the plot, the story is the most dated aspect of the film, and the reason why I am so uncomfortable with it as a whole. In fact, the issue was tackled by another film released in 1947, Crossfire, in a much more fully rounded way, so check that out.
You know we have a law against carrying a gun?
Sure.
Well, we have that law because a gun is dangerous. Well, hate. Monty's kind of hate is like a gun. If you carry it around with you, it can go off and kill somebody.
Returning to Gentleman's Agreement, the main problem that I have with it is that it all comes down to cultural appropriation. We only see anti-Semitism as it's witnessed by Peck, someone who is ultimately pretending to be Jewish. So, when the film finishes, he can just return to his normal, prejudice-free life.
I was Jewish for 6 months.
That's right, Phil.
As was written in a review by The Guardian at the time of the film's release, the film's fundamental fault is that it makes the question far too simple. You do not explain anti-Semitism, much less how to reduce it, simply by saying it's silly, objectionable, cowardly. Anti-Semitism is all of these things, but its roots are not pulled up so easily. The film is, in fact, something of a cheat. The thing is, that whilst I do have my reservations about Gentleman's Agreement and its story, it's hard for me to say it's a terrible film, as ultimately it is successful in its aim of pointing out how, by remaining silent, the middle classes are just as culpable for anti-Semitism as the anti-Semites themselves. There are a couple of moments in the film which showcase this to great effect. First, a scene where Peck's Jewish secretary says a slur, and Peck calls her out on it.
I hate anti-Semitism. I hate it when it comes from you or anybody who's Jewish just as much as I hate it when it comes from a Gentile.
Me?
And secondly, in probably the film's strongest moment, there is a scene where Dorothy Maguire tells a story of how someone at a party made an anti-Semitic comment.
I wanted to yell at him. I wanted to get up and leave. I wanted to say to everyone at that table, why do we sit here and take it when he's attacking everything that we believe in?
John Garfield's cutting response summarises everything the film has to say.
And what did you do?
By the time Gentleman's Agreement was released, Kazan was moving on in terms of what he expected from actors, and Peck's performance can be seen to highlight exactly what he didn't want. In New York, Kazan had been involved in setting up the Actors Studio, a training school where actors were able to learn the variations of the Stanislavski system that the group theatre had experimented with. The Actors Studio still exists today, and there's hundreds of famous actors amongst its alumni. At the studio, Kazan worked hard to teach actors how to use real emotions within their performances. He had discovered that the easiest way for an actor to create a good performance was to cast someone who had experienced something similar in their personal lives. This was something he had already done in Hollywood when casting for his first feature film. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn stars James Dunn as the alcoholic father of the family. Dunn was an actor who was a massive star in the 1930s, singing and dancing with Shirley Temple. But with musicals fading in popularity, Dunn began to lose work and sank into alcoholism. So, when Kazan was looking for an actor to play a washed-up alcoholic, he persuaded Dunn to stay sober and use his real-life experiences to give a great performance. Dunn would go on to win a Best Supporting Actor Oscar for the film. But for Gentleman's Agreement, Kazan was given little say in the casting. Instead, he was asked to work with Gregory Peck. Peck is best known for playing straight-faced, highly moral characters, and in this film, he is no different. His performance is fine, but to compare Peck to other performances in films directed by Kazan, you can see the startling difference. For all of Peck's excellent frowning in Gentleman's Agreement, there is never really a point in the film where you think he is anyone other than Gregory Peck. Peck's performance is very much of the external tradition, whilst Kazan was preparing to push his actors towards the internalised performances of Stanislavski. Just as Kazan wanted his actors to relate to the parts they were playing, Kazan, as a director, wanted to find a way to relate to his films on a personal level. And as Kazan gained more power over his productions, they would turn increasingly introspective. And whilst Gentleman's Agreement is not personal to Kazan on the same level as his later films, primarily because he was not Jewish, it can still be viewed as fitting into this category when viewed through the lens of the acting techniques Kazan was beginning to implement, as there is a strong parallel between these ideas and the main character's journey in the film. In order to better understand anti-Semitism, Peck's character makes a decision to become what he is not, and really experience discrimination to share the truth for a newspaper. This isn't too far off what Kazan was asking actors to do, as he asked them to better understand their characters and experience their emotions in order to share them with an audience. So, it is kind of ironic that the actor who plays a symbolic method actor in Gentleman's Agreement is not a method actor, but one of the older external tradition. Even though Gentleman's Agreement would go on to be a commercial success and win 3 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director for Kazan, the experience left him frustrated with his lack of control and the restrictions imposed on him by the studio heads. These restrictions were something he didn't experience when directing for the theatre in New York, where his reputation was ever increasing. It was around this time that he began to work with a young actor named Marlon Brando. For all the work and training of actors that Kazan and his contemporary teachers from the group theatre had been doing, it would take Brando, under Kazan's direction, to become the catalyst for the rise of method acting into the mainstream. Brando regularly attended sessions at the Actors Studio, and Kazan had previously cast him in a small part in a play he produced called Truckline Cafe. Whilst the play was a flop, running for just 13 shows, Brando's performance was a showstopper. But it wasn't until Kazan was struggling to cast a new play he was directing, A Streetcar Named Desire, that he considered Brando again. Despite Brando being much younger than the part of Stanley as originally written, Kazan saw him as perfect. He therefore gave Brando some money to catch a train and audition directly for the writer Tennessee Williams. When Brando never showed up, Kazan assumed he had been conned. Brando, however, had spent the money on food and instead of getting the train, hitchhiked to Williams' house, arriving several days later. When Brando did arrive, Williams was struggling with a broken toilet. Brando fixed the toilet and read for the part, and so his legend began. Brando's performance in Streetcar is one of the most celebrated in Broadway history, as he was able to become Stanley, wowing audiences with his combination of sensitivity, brute force, and real emotion. Brando would, however, struggle to find consistency in his performances during the play's 18-month run, with quality varying dramatically, as written in The New Yorker. In Kazan's view, others were giving fine performances, but Brando was living on stage, with the result that he longed to escape the play after only a few weeks. How many times, on schedule, can one rip oneself apart? Brando, recognising his dislike for repeating performances, thus made a move into Hollywood, with Streetcar being his last stage play. As soon as Streetcar finished its run on Broadway, Kazan was offered the chance to direct it as a film, and he did so, casting most of the Broadway cast, with the only exception being the addition of Vivien Leigh in the lead role of Blanche. Originally, Kazan planned to shoot the film on location and use extras to flesh out some of the characters' backstories. However, he soon backtracked, realising that the power of the play was in the words and the claustrophobic atmosphere of the apartment. In the final film, there are a few scenes at the beginning which were shot on location, but it was predominantly filmed on a set adapted so that the walls would come closer as the film progresses, further adding to the claustrophobia. The resulting film was a tour de force of acting, turning Brando instantly into an icon. In Streetcar, Brando achieves Stanislavski's aim of living the part in a way that is raw and effortless, be it mumbling lines with a mouthful of food,
I don't know any refined enough for your taste.
or screaming from the top of his lungs. Brando is mesmerising. As Isaac Butler describes, you can watch Streetcar a dozen times and still pick up new nuances in Brando's performance. His way with language is groundbreaking in its naturalism. The contrast with Vivien Leigh's Blanche could not be clearer in the film. Blanche's affectation is that of the studio system actor of the 1930s and 40s, but the fight remains the same. Realism versus magic. Despite Brando winning audiences over with his performance, it came too soon to woo Academy members. Although nominated, he was the only cast member not to win an Oscar for the film, losing out to Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen. After the success of Streetcar, Brando's newfound fame allowed him to get lead parts in 2 historical dramas, Viva Zapata, directed by Kazan, and Joseph Mankiewicz's adaptation of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. And while both of these films are enjoyable in a sense, Brando's performances show the limitation of the new style of method acting. In both of the films, Brando's mumbling feels odd and out of place within the environments.
The smell of a mare came in on the wind this morning and he's restless. So am I.
The evil that men do lives after them. The good is often interred with their bones, so let it be with Caesar.
While Brando was able to successfully become a contemporary person of the 1950s, playing characters who had been dead for 2,000 years, or a Mexican, was incredibly difficult and almost beyond him. I may have my problems with these performances, but audiences and the Academy did not. Brando was nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars for both of these films. It was Brando's next 2 roles, in which he returned to contemporary settings, that cemented his status as a legend of cinema. First, he played Johnny in The Wild One, a film about a motorbike gang who terrorise a quiet town. The Wild One was jumped on by rebellious teenagers as something they could connect with, sparking a boost in the sales of leather jackets. Again, Brando becomes Johnny, transforming for 80 minutes into the disillusioned youth. The whole film can be summed up in a single, iconic line.
Hey Johnny, what are you rebelling against?
What do you got?
The Wild One successfully captured a growing movement at the time towards rebellion in young people and has gained a cult status. And this finally brings us to On the Waterfront, the third collaboration between Brando and Kazan, and the film that would come to define both of their careers. There is a moment early in On the Waterfront where Brando awkwardly picks up his love interest's glove and proceeds to spend the rest of the scene fiddling with it and even trying it on. This small piece of improvisation by Brando shows the audience everything they need to know about his character and the uncertain romance between the two. The glove and Brando's decision transform what is a well-scripted conversation into something much more meaningful. A memorable moment of realism that epitomizes everything that is so great about On the Waterfront. Partially based on a series of Pulitzer Prize-winning articles called Crime on the Waterfront, the film follows Terry Malloy, played by Brando, a dock worker who struggles with guilt after playing a part in a murder. Malloy suffers a crisis of conscience as he realizes the corruption and must decide whether he wishes to join the corrupt union or testify against them. The issue becomes more complex when he falls for the sister of the dead man, played by Eva Marie Saint. But, as with many of Kazan's films, the story is not where the power lies. Instead, it is the theme and the feelings it creates that add an intensity to the film, with the acting particularly driving this. And, to be honest, I find it quite difficult to describe how good Brando is. But luckily, others like Dilys Powell have described Brando's performance in a lot more elegant fashion than me. As the racketeer's errand boy, too stupid to realise by himself the uses he is being subjected, but cajoled and prodded and angered at last into rebelling, his performance is magnificent. The muddled submissiveness, the isolation, the hints of sexuality, the outbursts of animal rage. Within the bounds set by the brutal society of this film, and others like it, there is no actor to touch him. The film also contains one of the most iconic moments in film history, when Terry is threatened by his brother in the back of a taxi. He tenderly pushes away the gun before going on to say the famous line,
You don't understand. I could have had class. I could have been a contender. I could have been somebody. Instead of a bum. Which is what I am.
I won't go into too much detail as this scene has been analysed extensively, but I will quickly read a quote from Brando himself about the scene, which I think captures what most people say. It was actor-proof, a scene that demonstrated how audiences often do much of the acting themselves in an effectively told story. It couldn't miss, because almost everyone believes he could have been a contender, so when people saw this in the film, they identified with it. That's the magic of theatre. Everybody in the audience became Terry Malloy. After being nominated for the 4th year running, Brando would finally win his first Oscar for this film, confirming his iconic status. The film would win a total of 8 Oscars, with the only category it didn't win being Best Supporting Actor, because Carl Malden, Rod Steiger and Lee J. Cobb were all nominated, and therefore split the vote. Brando's performance, and the performances of the supporting cast in On the Waterfront, are undeniably fantastic. The film would bring method acting into the mainstream, with pretty much every young actor wanting to replicate Brando, ultimately leading to internal acting replacing the classical external style. There is also a lot more to On the Waterfront than just these great performances. The film is also a masterclass in directing, as Elia Kazan finally realised the potential of cinema. By making the decision to produce the film independently with Sam Spiegel, rather than for a large studio, Kazan was able to have free reign over creative decisions. This resulted in a compelling film that combines elements of Italian neo-realism with classical Hollywood, creating something that feels starkly different from pretty much any film that came before it. Kazan chose to shoot the film almost entirely on location, taking his crew to the real streets of Hoboken, New Jersey. His aim was to capture the truth of the location, as well as the truth of his actors, and this bleeds through into the scenes. This newfound sense of realism had a massive impact on young filmmakers such as Martin Scorsese, as he describes.
When On the Waterfront burst on the screen, as they say in the cliche, but it did, 2 things were going on. One, it didn't seem like the film that came out of that system. It had a direct line for the truth of the way people think, the way people behave, the way people live, and how they live and where they live, even to the texture of the paint on the walls. We always talked about that, and the costumes, clothes, etc. The bars, the shirt the bartender wears, everything is literally as if it was shot in on Elizabeth Street or Mott Street or Mulberry Street.
Whether it's the icy breath of the characters, or a foghorn drowning out Brando's confession. The film captures realism in a powerfully effective way. And I couldn't make a video about the film without at least mentioning Leonard Bernstein's excellent score. If I had made this video without doing any further research. These exclamations of how good the film is, alongside a summary of how Kazan, in this film, became the first director to fully capture the essence of Stanislavski's performance style, would probably be the ending. But there is another side to On the Waterfront that is much more controversial and needs to be discussed. It is based around a decision that Kazan made in 1952, a decision that would affect the way he and all of his work would be perceived for the rest of his life. Back in the early 1930s, when he was working for the group theatre, Kazan was a member of the Communist Party, believing that communism and unity were the ways for those struggling to achieve a better life for themselves. But after just 18 months, he left the party because he disliked the growing influence that the party was attempting to impose on the plays he was directing and acting in. Kazan soon put the Communist Party behind him, and, as I've already discussed, spent the next 15 years making films and plays that asserted him as a prominent voice in the liberal world. Then, in the late 1940s, with the Cold War in full swing, the US government turned on communism. The House of Un-American Activities Committee was formed and set its sights on Hollywood, targeting anyone within the industry who was deemed to have had a communist connection. Thus began the Hollywood Blacklist, and a dark era for creatives in America. I won't go into full details on the Blacklist, but there are a bunch of interesting films about it which are worth checking out, with the best known, and probably the most well-rounded, being Trumbo. The gist of the Blacklist is that if you were called before the committee and refused to disavow communism and name the names of those you knew to have links to the party, you would be added to the blacklist and unable to work, or worse, put into prison. It didn't take long before Kazan was called before the committee to testify. After initially appearing behind closed doors in January 1952, Kazan was summoned a second time and in April testified as a friendly witness. In his statement, he went into some detail over his involvement with the party and named the names of 8 members of the group theatre who he knew to have been communists. You can find his entire statement on the LA Weekly website, and it's a fascinating read. As soon as Kazan's testimony went public, it was seen as a betrayal by many creatives in the industry. They saw the committee and the blacklist as an attack on people's freedoms, going against the American Constitution. They thought that Kazan, with his prominent position as one of the most influential directors, was only fueling further attacks by cooperating. Consequently, many of Kazan's friends rejected him, altering his life forever. Kazan, in response to the criticism he faced, doubled down on his actions, taking out an advert in the New York Times to explain the reasons for his decision. In the advert, he justifies his actions by saying, "I believe that the American people can solve this problem wisely only if they have the facts about communism, all the facts." He also highlights that his decision was not intended to undercut the liberal message of his body of work, and that he would continue to make films and plays in a similar vein. The advert, however, only further angered his peers, and ultimately many in the industry would never forgive him. In fact, when in 1999, nearly 50 years after his testimony, Kazan was given an honorary Oscar, many protested against the decision, and when he was presented the award, half of the audience refused to applaud, whilst many of those who did clap were not exactly enthusiastic. Following his testimony, Kazan made a quick return to filmmaking, escaping his critics by heading to Germany to direct the film Man on a Tightrope, set in Czechoslovakia. Man on a Tightrope follows a circus owner who is set to lose his livelihood to the newly imposed communist government. Instead of giving up his circus as he is commanded, he instead sets about to escape. I mentioned earlier about Kazan being at his best when he directed films with parallels to his real life, and Man on a Tightrope is a good example of this, as well as disavowing communism, something which only further proved to both his critics and the committee that he was genuine in his testimony. Man on a Tightrope is ultimately about escape and the freedom to make art, two things which at that time were extremely important to Kazan. There is even a scene in which the communist police arrest the circus owner, asking him to alter his performance to be more in keeping with their beliefs, a clear echo to what Kazan said he had experienced when in the group theatre. But it was after he returned to America that Kazan would make the film which really explored the personal struggles he was undergoing, and it was, as you probably guessed, On the Waterfront. There was an interview of Orson Welles talking to French students in the 1980s, which sums up exactly what people see as the problems with On the Waterfront.
Elia Kazan is a traitor. He is a man who sold to McCarthy all of his companions. And having sold all of his people to McCarthy, he then made a film called On the Waterfront, which was a celebration of the informer. And therefore, no question which uses him as an example can be answered by me.
And watching On the Waterfront with the idea of it being a celebration of the informer does allow the film to take on a different dimension. When I first saw the film, well before I had any knowledge of Kazan's actions, I definitely connected with Terry Malloy and the character. The film makes very clear that testifying is Malloy's righteous course of action. The dock worker officials are shown to be villains out to exploit and even murder union workers. So of course it is a moral thing to stand up and expose them.
Then don't fight him like a hoodlum down here in the jungle, because that's just what he wants. He'll hit you in the head and plead self-defense. You'll find him in the courtroom tomorrow with the truth. As you know the truth.
But when you factor in Kazan's testimony to this reading, it becomes a little watered down. Kazan is directly comparing his former friends, liberal people who had done nothing illegal, with murderous villains, and it just feels a little drastic to me, highlighting Kazan's own arrogance and lack of understanding of the wider view of the committee's actions, as written in a review on Slash Film. Framing On the Waterfront as a portrait of the common man and the need for good unions and workers' rights feels completely incongruous to what Kazan's actual testimony accomplished, considering that the communists he named would believe in those ideals more than anyone. Also, for this reading to really work, Terry Molloy must serve as a stand-in for Kazan himself, and whilst he is a great character performed in an exemplary way, this just doesn't quite work. Sure, Kazan, like Molloy, felt trapped on all sides when he received his summons to testify, and of course he would have felt some doubt as he debated whether or not to do so, but in the film, Molloy has no other real option. He's a working-class nobody who only really dreams of being a contender. Kazan, in contrast, when he testified, was already a huge success who had made a fortune directing films and plays, and even if he had been blacklisted, it would have only been from the films, so he would have still been able to continue to work on Broadway. The fact that he was able to afford an advert in the New York Times to respond to his critics speaks volumes within itself. So, in my opinion anyway, the testimony part of the film doesn't quite stand up to the celebration of the informer reading that many people subscribe, but I do think there are still moments within On the Waterfront in which Kazan's own emotions and thoughts about his decision do bleed through, with the most notable being the use of bird imagery, be it the flock of workers scrambling to collect tokens, or the talk of hawks.
This city is full of hawks. That's a fact. They hang around on top of the big hotels, and you spot a pigeon in the park, right down on them.
The film is packed with references to birds, with the running thread of Molloy's pigeons being the most explicit. From the use of a pigeon as bait in the opening scene, through to Molloy's tender love of his birds on the rooftop. Pigeons are used primarily to represent Terry's own inner conflict. Terry's pigeons are trapped in a cage, and if they could have their own way, would fly to freedom, a clear parallel to Terry's own want to escape. And of course, the fact that a common term for a police informer is a stool pigeon only strengthens the link to Kazan. After his testimony, Kazan was labelled a stool pigeon by many of his critics, a phrase which would stick with him for the rest of his life.
Kazan is nothing more than a lowly stool pigeon.
After Molloy testifies, he returns to the safety of his pigeons and finds them all murdered, showing how the people close to Molloy have turned against him, and again creating a parallel between Kazan and the loss of his friends.
A pigeon from pigeons!
But it is Molloy's response to rejection at the end of On the Waterfront, which is, for me, the most interesting comparison to Kazan's real life. Following the death of his pigeons, Molloy decides to turn up for work at the docks. Then, when he is shunned by the dock workers, he turns to the only talent he ever had, boxing, to fight back and prove his point. This kind of echoes Kazan's own journey to making this film, as, after all his friends had rejected him, Kazan returned to the only thing he knew how to do, filmmaking, in an attempt to create a response. And, just as Molloy puts up a good fight, Kazan would go on to make one hell of a film. At the end of the day, whatever your thoughts are on Kazan and his decision to testify, it's difficult not to appreciate him as an artist. Whilst it did take Kazan several films to find his feet in filmmaking, he was a pioneer of using Stanislavski's system to get emotions from his actors in a way that no one had done to the same extent before him. How much of Brando's early genius was reliant on Kazan, and how much of it was just pure genius, it's difficult to know, but the combination of the two together ushered in a new look to American filmmaking that would have an influence on the next generation of filmmakers. The real question to end this video is, should a film be viewed as a separate entity to those who created it? A question which seems to be increasingly popping up in the modern world as filmmakers' questionable actions are increasingly brought into public light. And the answer? I think it all depends on your individual opinion on what a filmmaker has done or been accused of. In the case of On the Waterfront and Kazan, I personally find his actions to be questionable, but looking back at the era from a modern perspective, I can also in some way understand the fear of what he was going through and why he thought it was a better decision to testify. I would also argue that some of his earlier films, such as Gentleman's Agreement and Pinky, a film which I've avoided mentioning in this video, contain many more dated and potentially offensive moments than On the Waterfront. So my summary is this, that it's basically up to an individual to decide whether or not Kazan's films have artistic merit, or if they are just ego-filled apologist crap. But the fact that people like me are still discussing and enjoying films like On the Waterfront 70 years after they were made says something about the power of the work itself. I will leave you with another quote from the Orson Welles interview.
I have to add that he is a very good director.
Thanks for watching. One more thing I wanted to cover. In the footage I used from the 1999 Oscars, you can see that Robert De Niro has a frankly ridiculous haircut, so I couldn't not research why. So just to explain it quickly, this travesty occurred because at the time, De Niro was in the middle of filming a stint as fearless leader in the adaptation of Rocky and Bullwinkle, a film which I unfortunately now own, and the only film referenced in this video which I would not recommend you to watch.
Are you talking to me? Well, I'm the only one here. So you must be talking to me.
Things I do for YouTube, eh?